So let's now talk about function REST parameters and something called the arguments object. Now these are two different styles, and one is new and one is considered an older way of doing things, but essentially they do almost the same thing. So let's create our function definition of make car. Now instead of just a make car, we're in fact going to make a car price based on some parameters that we pass in. Now you could think of these as prices of particular part numbers. When you're speccing up a new car, you can choose those additional options. So we're just going to write a nice simple function which adds them all up for us. Now before we go any further, let's go ahead and call our make car price function. Now first off, we'll start adding some numbers just so we can see the individual prices. So each of these is going to be an item that we want to essentially add. Now the interesting piece is we could in fact pass all of these arguments into this function without specifying any kind of parameter. So you may be wondering how we do this. Now, if you're familiar with JavaScript, you may have seen this keyword called the arguments before. Now, if we have a look over in our console, you can see that this is almost looking like an array. It's not an array. This is something called an array-like object. And it's array-like because it doesn't have all of those properties that a typical array might. And we can confirm this by saying array dot is array, and then we can essentially pass that argument in. So here we see the value of false, and again we'll just add that argument back in so we can see it. So it's definitely not an array, which means that we can't iterate it using typical array methods, which we'll visit in the next few chapters, but it doesn't stop us from turning it into an array or even iterating it. So what we want to do this, and the use case for this arguments object, is we might want to, for example, just take the first argument and use a square bracket 0 to look up the first item. So you can see here that the arguments also uses a 0-based index, much like the string and an array, which we haven't covered just yet. But you can see that we can access any of these values by specifying which index we would in fact like. Now, just accessing that one on its own might not be a very good use case, but it can be a very nice idea if you want to, for instance, just grab the first item and then perhaps do something with the rest of the items. So before we go any further, I want you to kind of understand this arguments object. So what we're going to do is loop over each of these arguments, and then we'll dynamically add them up. So we don't have to specify them as function parameters one by one, because we might have something like number 1, number 2, and it becomes quite hard to keep track of and extend the function. So doing it this way, depending on your use case, it's not a very common use case that we'd want to do this, but I'm sure you can find a way that you could integrate this into your workflow. Now, there are a few ways we could iterate this arguments. We could use a typical for loop. We could use for in. However, because it's almost an array, we're going to convert it to an array. And we'll do this using array from. Now you can see here that this accepts some kind of iterable or an array-like object. So it creates a new array from an iterable object. So what we could now do is say dot for each, we get that value, and using a quick arrow function, we can console log out that value. So you can see here that we have 11, 44, 55, and 99 as specified. If we were, however, to extend this, we don't have to go back and modify our function parameters. We can just simply add something, and this arguments object gives us absolutely everything that is passed in. So we'll save this out and we'll see 22 has now been added to our console log. Now the idea of this was to, in fact, add all of these values. So a for each isn't really what we want. We're going to use the reduce method in an array. Now this accepts a previous value or a next value. Now you can call these whatever you like, but inside the body of the arrow function, all we're going to do is say previous plus next. Now, once we save this, we don't in fact see anything because we're not logging out the result. So because array from creates a new array based off of this argument, and we're in fact using a reduce, Now, I mentioned previously when we looked at arrow functions that this is implicitly returning these values. So what's happening here is something like this, where we have return previous plus next. So that is exactly the same as what we were just showing. When we want to return something, which we definitely do to our reduce, because reduce creates a new array based off all the items that we are passing through. Now, because we are in fact returning every single time, we can say const the total equals the array from, and now we can log out that one single value, that total price in here. So we have 231, which is what all of these are added together. Now we could be quite fancy and use some backticks, and we can say total and then add a $sign and interpolate that. Now what we might want to do as well, we could say USD or something on the end, and here we have the total 231 USD. Now, anytime that we would change this, so we could change it to 66, and that total price is then reflected. So that's how we can use the arguments object. Now, I wanted to show you this up front because this is almost considered the old way of doing things, using that arguments object. Now, what we can do is use something called the rest parameter, which is considered the new way of doing it. This is added in ES 2015, so it's a new way of accessing this arguments object. Now, immediately here we see array is array, and it is false. It's not an array. Whereas this new method of doing things, which I'm explaining, is in fact an array. So it makes our lives far easier. So let's continue down, and we'll create another example here. Now we'll call this the make car price, and I'm going to call this the rest one because we're going to use this rest parameter. Now what we'll do underneath this, we can make car price rest. Now what we'll do is pass in some different numbers. So we'll do 99, 88, 77. Pick any numbers that you like for purposes of this video. Now what we want to do is essentially grab all of these using the new way of doing things. So arguments is considered the old way. Now we are using Babel to transform it. So Babel, we will write the code in this syntax and it will transform it into the old syntax, and at some point in the future we can switch Babel off and everything will work natively and we'll have super fast modern JavaScript in the browser. Now the rest parameter is in fact quite easy. What we'll do is call these the params. Now we can't access the params directly and get all of these given to us. This params will so far just give us this. Now if we did want perhaps the number 1, this would give us access to 99, and params would be the argument number 2. Now, if we add a ... in front of this params, something quite magical happens. So first off, let's console log our number 1, and then we'll console log this params. So you can see here that we have a number 99, that's that first argument here, and then params is being passed in and giving us what looks like a nice array. And we can actually confirm that it's an array because the proto is pointing to an array as well. It also has a length of 4, so it pretty much looks like an array. Now, the interesting piece is this is called the rest parameter because it gives us the rest of the arguments. So that's a good way that you can think about remembering, oh, this is the rest of the arguments. So that means that we can add the rest parameter. And it's a good thing to note that you cannot swap these around. If we try to do something like this, everything's going to go wrong and things will blow up. So when we want the rest, it needs to always be at the end. Similarly, we couldn't do something like this. So it needs to go at the end and it gives us the rest of the arguments. So you know how to use it, you can use it on its own. So what we'll do now is go ahead and delete this. And I'm going to say array.isArray again, and we'll pass this params in. Now you can see here that we have true being printed out. So this is in fact an array, and it's much better because it's added to the language, and we like things such as functional programming, using things like .reduce like we did above, but now we don't have to convert this arguments object into an array. So this is really nice because we can say params and then just directly go ahead and start reducing. So we can say previous followed by next, and then we're going to add the previous and next values together. we'll go ahead and do the same as above. We'll say the const total, and we will console log out our total. So there you go, we have it. We have 319, and we can be nice and fancy and say the total and interpolate that value and close it off with a backtick. So there we go, we have total 319 USD. And remember, this is the new way of doing it. And even to look at, we don't have to deal with this random looking arguments object that magically exists inside our function. It makes more sense and it feels more like we're writing proper code by having our arguments passed in, and then we get given them as an array of params. Once we have that array, we can do anything with it. And here I'm just reducing those values to one single value and printing out our total. So that's how we can use our arguments object. This is still perfectly valid JavaScript. If you do want to do it, it's absolutely fine. It's not going anywhere anytime soon in JavaScript, as it would break probably quite a large amount of the internet. But this is the new ES 2015 way of writing JavaScript and achieving the same thing with less effort and less code.